As OT pen testers, how do we gain access to industrial environments from over the internet? How do we find those OT assets that are exposed? And that's what we're going to cover. We're going to look at, in this part of the course, the two different paths. We're going to look at how you can use a normal or general search engine like Google to find exposed assets. And we're also going to look at how we can use specialized search engines like Shodan and Zumai. So we're going to look at those two paths in this video. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So welcome to part 5. So this is where we're going to talk about performing reconnaissance and open source intelligence gathering, right? Gathering as much information about a target environment as possible. But then not only gathering that information, but distilling it down to the actual data or intelligence that we can use as our job as penetration testers to evaluate the security of the target environment. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. So we're going to talk about reconnaissance. We're going to talk about open source intelligence gathering. We're going to talk about common tools. And most of these are free to use websites that you can access on the internet. Or there could be a small charge, but usually it's relatively inexpensive, usually. So when we look at the overall OT penetration testing methodology, remember, we're going to start with reconnaissance. This is where, again, we're going back to square one. And so when we look for a target environment, we can start to see what systems or assets that they have exposed to the internet. That's at least part of the reconnaissance and OSINT process that we're going to talk about. So like in this example, this is a Allen Bradley or Rockwell PLC that's exposed to the internet. And we can see sensitive pieces of information like its internal IP address and the firmware version. So we could use that information to see, are there any vulnerabilities in this PLC that potentially we could use to exploit the system? In fact, we can even see the copyright is from 2009, which usually would indicate that, yeah, this PLC hasn't been updated since 2009. And so we can find these types of assets like this PLC from Allen Bradley, which got bought out by Rockwell a while back. And so we can find these assets that are exposed to the internet. And we'll actually see in this section how we can find these assets, not even having to use a specialized search engine like Shodan and Zumai and other, which are great and which are fun to use, but actually find these with just by using Google. So when you talk about reconnaissance, remember, this is where we start our penetration testing engagement, whether it's in IT or OT. We're almost always starting with some form of reconnaissance from the outside looking in. Now, if you're only doing an internal pen test, then this isn't going to come in play. But we talked about in the previous sections, right? There's different types of reconnaissance because we have active reconnaissance and passive reconnaissance. Remember, with active, that's where we're actually crafting or creating network packets and sending them towards the target environment. And while that is usually seen as acceptable in IT environments, there's always that hesitancy in OT environments to send packets to a target OT environment. So we don't focus as much as in active reconnaissance in this course because we're really focused on passive reconnaissance. We don't want to send packets towards a target environment because what if those packets were to cause some type of issue with that asset, and then it has this rippling effect where it impacts the availability, right? The process or the equipment that asset is responsible for monitoring and controlling. So when we talk about OSINT, this is where we're using purely passive means, which also means you don't necessarily need a client's authorization to do this type of testing. When I've done penetration tests in the past, if I ever get a potential client that reaches out, a lot of times I'll just start doing the passive reconnaissance just to see what's there, whether I know that I'm going to end up working with them or not. But just out of curiosity. Remember, you don't need a client's permission or a potential client's permission to use tools like Google or Shodan or other utilities or tools we have on the internet that we can use to find out information about that target environment. So we do have a strong focus on OSINT and passive only reconnaissance in OT, ICS, penetration testing. And this is where, we're just leveraging the data that's out there on the internet that's available for us to access. Again, it could be behind a paywall or not. Like Shodan's a great tool that everybody loves to use for OT pen testing, but it comes with it comes with a limited free account, but the free account is limited. So it's not where we can access all data for free, but we can access data that is made available. And we'll definitely be talking a lot more about Shodan in a few. So ultimately, though, what are we trying to find with reconnaissance or OSINT from an OT or ICS perspective? So a lot of times what we're focused on is finding IP addresses, right? What IP addresses are associated with that target environment? So usually we'll start with things like domain names, like maybe the main target domain or the main domain name of your target organization, and start using tools like DNSdumpter and DNSlytics that we'll look at in this section. How we can use those tools to find IP addresses and IP ranges, subnets associated with those domains. Because once we have those IP addresses, then we can look at, well, what open ports do we see in those IP ranges or on those individual IP addresses? Because then we can take those individual ports and then we can map them to different services and applications. And as we find those services and applications, and especially find out, well, what vendor or manufacturer created that service or that software that's running, what version of that service or software is running, because then we can use that versioning information to determine, are there any vulnerabilities on these systems that we're finding exposed to the internet? And of course, we go through the same process when we're on the inside of the network. The big part of what we're talking about here is going through reconnaissance and OSINT from the internet perspective, right? Finding those assets that are exposed to the internet and finding vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are going to be those cracks that we can use to slip through to gain access to get that initial foothold on the OT network. Now we started to look at, right, different OSINT sources that we have available. And we did mention one already, right? We can start to look at the main websites and domain names associated with the target company that we're looking at. Now, I typically stay away from industrial and OEM vendors for this course. I don't want to upset anybody. So we do use different companies that have open bug bounty programs like Netflix and Starbucks. But the principles, they're still the same, right? Being able to find out information about these environments that we can use to help us be more successful in our penetration test. So starting with that target company's webpage, their main domain. So there's a lot of information we can find out about the company just from that main webpage often. Now we'll spend some time, we'll look at social media, because employees can post a lot of things, and including a lot of sensitive information that they're not supposed to, whether it's on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, X, Reddit, the list goes on. And we'll definitely look at some great horrific examples. You can find information about target environments by reading the news, different articles about those environments, or maybe press releases that the company had actually put out on the internet talking about their new environment and all the new equipment and the new assets and what vendors they're using and what types of software and what type of equipment. And they're putting that information out there for the general public to see, but then it can also be used against them by attackers. And then there's also different government publications that you can use, especially, which is interesting, like in the United States where we have SEC, or the Security Exchange Commission. So publicly traded companies in the United States, if they actually had some type of breach, they would have to file a report with the SEC. And sometimes those can expose sensitive pieces of information and other filings that they would have with the government. So there's lots of interesting tidbits of information out there from all these different places. So what we're learning about in this course is how we find, of course, all this information, but then how do we boil it down to just those pieces of information that are going to help us do our job as a penetration tester. So we're going to start with the target company's homepage, right? That's almost always where we'll start. Now, a lot of times you might have the client that they'll just give you a list of their IP addresses, and they're not asking you to find those during the test, which I think is good and bad, because sometimes the client might actually have IP ranges that they're not aware of. I've seen that more than a few times. So I always appreciate when a client, and maybe they'll come and say, hey, here's the list of IP addresses that we know about, but we'd also like you to see, hey, are there any other IP addresses? Are there any systems out there that are exposed to the internet that we have that we're not aware of? So when we start looking at the company's website, and what we can do is we can look for alternatives. So let's say if I use Netflix as our target organization to start with. So we can know, or we can go to netflix.com, and that would be one target, even the website itself. And then that website, right, has an IP address, which ultimately can look to see, does it have any vulnerabilities ultimately? But there's not only probably netflix.com, but well, what about netflix.net, netflix.org, netflix.io, and so on? You get the idea. And so we can use different types of tools to map those out. There's actually a script in the course materials, that one we created with ChatGPT, that actually checks for you. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a script you can find in the course materials called check domain variants. So you can see if I run this, it's going to ask me to input a domain name and the domain, or the full domain name, including the top level domain, the .com, the .eu. And so in this case, I'm just going to type in Netflix, and you see it'll actually put in those top level domains for you to see what exists and what doesn't, because each of these could be a potential target. Now, remember, just because you found them, it doesn't necessarily mean that that IP address or the domain is owned by the target organization. So verify with them before you do any testing. But again, this is just one of those quick, easy, little utilities that you can use to find potentially these other targets, right? Each domain not only is a target itself, right? Because we have an IP address for each of these, but there could be other hosts associated with each of these domains as well. And each of those is a target. So it's just one way we can start to find more targets that are associated with the target organization. So going back to starting with a target company's main website, there's a lot of information that a lot of companies have that they put on their website, right, with good intentions to make it available to the general public, right, to help establish trust and show pieces of information that they want the public to have, so that they can determine maybe they want to work with that company. And so you see a lot of information. You think of, you go to lots of websites and they have a list of all their corporate executives, right? All of the leadership team, which is great to make that information available. But we also have to remember that can be used by attackers for attacks like phishing campaigns. Or what if you're looking at physical security assessments and the target company's website lists all of their physical locations? You're just giving the attackers a list of targets. So, right, we have to look at these websites, with that attacker mindset. One thing that was mentioned in the last slide that we didn't dive into yet, and Jason Haddix had come up with this, was using the copyright statement at the bottom of a web page. That we can use that copyright statement to find other websites associated with the same organization that maybe they just don't pop out right away in other types of searches. What that means is if let's say Starbucks is our target and we scroll to the very bottom, right, we have that copyright statement that says, oh, copyright 2025 Starbucks Coffee Company, all rights reserved. Well, what happens if I copy that and I go ahead and let's put it in Google, which I can't spell. I'll put it in quotes just to make sure it keeps the text that it's searching for exactly the same. And now we can run that search and see anywhere on the internet where Google at least has found that same exact phrase. And now we start finding other targets for the organization, because you can see that first result that Google comes back with is investor.starbucks.com. Well, that's a completely different website, which is probably on a completely different IP address. So we have this other target. Remember, with websites, not only do those websites have vulnerabilities, but they run on web services and web servers that have their own vulnerabilities. And those run on top of operating systems that have their own vulnerabilities. So there's lots of options for vulnerabilities when we have web services involved. But we can see not only, sure, investor.starbucks.com or starbucks.com itself. And then we can keep scrolling through the list to see if there's any other items of note, right? We can see, oh, there's a sbucks.co, or maybe that gets truncated as .com. I think it's sbucks.co. So we can start looking for those results, and you can see there's tons of them. Of course, then you can even just start removing things like, hey, don't show me starbucks.com. Just take it out of the list. We already know. Don't show me investor.starbucks.com. We're going to look at that a little bit later. But that's one way where we can start to find other targets that Jason Haddix had talked about. And I thought I'm like, wow, that's an awesome idea. And I've actually used that in pen test to find quite a few targets that the client didn't even realize that they still had these things exposed to the internet. And here you see an example when I ran that search during the last class and found other domains like, oh, Starbucks card b2b.com, Starbucks 2024 rd.q4web.com. So there's lots of different targets that we can find just by using that copyright statement, right? Really cool. So DNSlytics is a tool that I use fairly often. I used to use it more when I was doing things like incident response, running a SOC, those doing research on IP addresses and domains. But so that's where I first came across it. But I've also used it in pen test, right? And doing OSINT. So I really like the tool, and they've changed it a little bit over time and for better or for worse, but I still see it as my go-to tool, though I know there's lots of other similar tools out there, so different folks have different tools that they like, right? But regardless of the platform, right, the nice thing about tools like DNSlytics is that I can go in, right? We can log in, or we can just access the page and give it a domain name or an IP address, right, that we want to find out more information about. Right. And this is one of those changes. So now they have this big menu to say, hey, you ran a search for Netflix.com. And they're saying, hey, do you want a report associated with the IP address that resolves to? Right? Do you want a reverse IP report? You want to see the history of what domains and fully qualified domain names have been associated with that IP address over time. You can see with the lock that requires a paid account. In this case, we just want to say, hey, I just want the domain report for Netflix. They should just give you everything in one page, which is really, really nice. And now they've broken it up. So, but for now, I just want to look, yeah, just show me the domain report for Netflix.com. Right? And gives us some basic information so we can see, right, when it was registered. So in this case, we could see, okay, that's before 2010. You see, very popular site, as we would imagine, right? We don't see any related domains by default, right? Like we used the little script for earlier, but when you run those searches, that can help you find other related domains. The DNS records, and so you can see the first thing that we're tracking are the NS records. So that's for name servers. So these are the DNS servers for Netflix.com. So if you're ever accessing Netflix.com or any host with a Netflix.com at the end of that fully qualified domain name, these are the DNS servers that ultimately you're using for doing that DNS lookup. Now you can see the A and the quadruple A records. So those are the TCP or the IP version 4 and the IP version 6 records that they have associated with just Netflix.com. Now, what we're actually seeing here, not just the IP addresses, whether it's IP version 4, like we see up in like this top half, and then these really ugly IP version 6 IP addresses. But those are also associated, you see over on the right-hand side, with an autonomous system number. So typically you see these for medium to especially larger environments that have multiple IP addresses or IP ranges. And they want to be able to collect them into one administrative bucket. So that's why when you see like these first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 IP addresses, and we look at they're associated with an ASN of 16509, well, the provider or the owner of that block or that ASN, well, that's Amazon. So anytime that you're hitting one of these IP addresses, you're actually hitting that ASN of 16509, which means you're actually hitting a system that's hosted in Amazon. So think from an attacker or a pen testing perspective, if my goal is to get on that target network of the organization, I'm not going to worry about those cloud-based resources. What I'm looking for is, oh, well, what about those IP version 6 addresses? Because we see, oh, this is a different ASN. Right? That's 40,027, and that is associated with Netflix streaming services. Now, that still could be a data center owned and managed and operated by Netflix, but could also be corporate headquarters or an office associated with Netflix, the network that would be our target. I start to get the idea. So that's how ASNs come into play. So it helps us distinguish what's hosted essentially on premise for a company versus what's hosted in the cloud. So almost, unless we're doing cloud pen testing for the client, right, we're not worried about cloud-based resources. We're only looking for those resources associated with that particular target company. Now there's the MX records. So these are all the mail servers associated with Netflix.com. So if you're sending email to support@netflix.com, then it's actually going to one of these mail servers. And then you can see, okay, that's hosted in Google's cloud. Right? So again, there's a lot of good information. And we still haven't even got to things like the WHOIS information down below. Now, WHOIS information has changed over time because these days, when you look at most of the records, they've all been stripped of all of the private information that would be a special identifier. And so you don't necessarily know the person who registered it, or you have like their direct contact information. But at least you have an email address and a phone number to call or to reach out to if you do have, let's say, your network is under attack and you see this traffic coming from this IP address. And you can do that lookup with DNSlytics and get that email and the phone number. So again, you can reach out and say, hey, my network is experiencing an attack from your network. You need to look into this. So that's one way you could use it from an incident response perspective. Right. So WHOIS information is great. That was really fascinating because up till about 6 months ago, if you ran WHOIS on Starbucks, you actually would see the name of the person 20 years ago who had registered the domain. And their title was basically network administrator at the time. And now they're like the senior VP of network infrastructure for Starbucks. So they've climbed up the ranks over the last 20 years. But again, up till 6 months ago, you would actually see their old, their name with their old title and have all their old contact information. So you have, their cell phone number and their office address. And so I thought that was really interesting because then you could also take their name and you could look them up on LinkedIn to find out more information about them. Right? Another little OSINT. And we're going to get into LinkedIn in a few. That's why I like DNSlytics because it gives you a lot of those the overview, and you can learn some good things right from those DNS records and looking for things like autonomous system numbers, and then of course the WHOIS information as well. So DNSdumpter is another great tool to use, and here's a screenshot you can see of using it to look up records associated with Starbucks.com. So it's different than DNSlytics because you're actually giving it a domain name and saying, hey, give me a list of all the hosts that you are aware of in this domain. So we can use that to find different targets. So here's what DNSdumpter looks like. So simple interface, right? Go to the page and just type in a domain that we're looking for. So in this case, we're going to do Netflix. We will run it. It's super fast. You can see it just takes a couple seconds and they come back. Now, it is more limited. They just recently changed it. So you can see they only give you the first 50 records for free. If you want more, and they even tell you, hey, we're showing you 50 records, but there's actually really 185. So if you want the full 185, you either need to pay for access, or a little workaround is that there's a tool out there written by Tim Tomes called Reconnaissance. It used to be one of the more popular open source reconnaissance OSINT tools. And it's still effective for certain things. It's just because of the way different OSINT resources now have really restricted a lot of the API functionality. It's just not as effective as it used to be. But there is a module in there called Hacker Target. Hacker Target is the group that put DNSdumpter together. So if you use the Hacker Target module in Reconnaissance, it actually will bypass that limit, I think up to 500 records. So just a little note. But anyways, that when you run a search in DNSdumpter, you can see it's very similar to what we were seeing in DNSlytics. Right, except now it's just saying, hey, we know about all of these hosts in the Netflix.com domain. Here's the IP addresses, right? Here's the autonomous system number, and then the entity that ASN is associated with. So remember, right, we can use that to determine what's hosted in the cloud versus what's hosted on premise. And then DNSdumpter also has additional information. So it does have some basic port information. So we can see, is there a web service or a web app or site sitting on that IP address, right? And then we can see, okay, there's Amazon CloudFront and, an AWS sitting there of course, in the cloud, right? Or you can see this cast-oc.netflix.com, right? And it's running on free Nginx. And that, there's also another name for this entity called secure.netflix.com. So we're starting to find more and more names, which means more and more targets, which gets us potentially more ports, which is more applications and services, which ultimately, right, based off of the version of the software and those applications running, could have more vulnerabilities. So as a pen tester, right, or as an attacker, right, we want more vulnerabilities, that those cracks that we can use to slip in and gain that foothold on the network. Not to mention, right, we do have this list of hosts. And so we start to look for names that also might be of interest. Right. And Netflix is interesting because they use a lot of, I see Jarvis. I'm not sure if that's the Iron Man Jarvis, but they use a lot of Star Wars names as well. So there's like, Vader and Obi-Wan, and I think this is maybe an alphabetical order list. So we probably won't get to any Obi-Wans and Vaders, but you get the idea that we might have some names jump out at us that we might use that to steer towards one target more than another. Like a good example is if you see, maybe like production.netflix.com, or right, production dot whatever your target domain is, and then you could have test or QA.netflix.com. Well, from an attacker mindset, we started thinking, well, usually, or sometimes at least, QA and test environments are less secure than production. So we might want to target those QA and test environments first. That's one of those examples of like why we could use tools like DNSdumpter to find those hosts and find some names of interest. Not to mention, it shows us ports and potentially versions of software, and shows us the ASN, so we can determine what's hosted in the cloud, which we're more than likely not going to target, versus what's hosted on-prem, on-site, and in our case, right, for OT, in a plant, that's going to be our target. So the first lab for this module, for this part of the course, is going to walk you through not only using some of those custom scripts, like where we're checking for domains that exist, but also walking through tools like DNSlytics and DNSdumpter, which again are free to use there's some limitations there, but honestly, they're going to work for most folks, I think, just to do some basic testing, and you don't necessarily have to worry about a paid account unless, again, you're doing full-time incident response or penetration testing where it would become more useful. But that's what you're going to do in Lab 5.1. Now, when we're talking about using those different tools like DNSdumpter, DNSlytics, right? Part of the point was to be able to find the different IP addresses, right, associated with that target domain. Because remember, we want to resolve those names to IP addresses, because then we're going to examine those IP addresses for open ports, because those open ports are associated with those services and applications that ultimately we want to see, are there any vulnerabilities that we can exploit from over the internet in this case. So we can actually find even IP addresses by doing searches in a tool like Shodan. So here's Shodan, and we're maybe jumping a little bit ahead. But remember, the idea is that Shodan will scan the entire internet, so every IP address on the internet, for a couple of dozen ports, and mostly TCP ports with a few UDP ports thrown in there. It does not scan all 65,535 TCP ports, and definitely not scanning all of the UDP ports, just a few select, because of the way UDP works when we're trying to scan it. But we can use Shodan to not only do lookups for specific IP addresses, and again, we'll get to that, but we can actually put in a name like Starbucks, which pulls up some interesting results, because you have to remember, when Shodan finds an open port, that it will not only find the port, but it makes additional connections and sends additional requests trying to figure out, hey, what's actually running on this port? Is it a web server? Is it telnet? Is it a protocol like we would see in OT, like Modbus or S7 or BACnet or DMP3? So it wants to try to figure out what's actually there. So it's going to index all of the information that is returned. Sometimes we talk about banner grabbing, right? We connect to a service, and a lot of services would have a banner that they would display. And then you could index that information. So we can run a search for a name like Starbucks. And so anywhere in the world, and you can see there's not many. There were only 139 instances. So not many, but more than zero. To where we can actually see where someone in the world has a system and it has a service that when it's queried by Shodan, it actually responds with the word Starbucks somewhere in essentially that text. So we can look at this first one down in Argentina. Looks like that Telecom Argentina, as that's probably the name of a telecom down there, right? An ISP. And we can see for that host, we see port 80 open, 161. So that's going to be UDP 161 for SNMP, Simple Network Monitoring Protocol or Monitor Protocol. Right, 2002, 6002. Not exactly sure what those are off the top of my head. Of course, port 80 is for web page. And we can actually see that web page is associated with the Cisco iOS HTTP config. So it's like, oh, okay, well, this is some type of Cisco gear, could be a firewall. This is actually probably a router. And since it's running Cisco IS, it's probably kind of one of the lower end ISP Cisco routers out there. And that they've exposed that interface to the internet. So bad on the ISP, right? And we can see, oh yeah, they have UDP 161 for SNMP. They even connect, and you can see, okay, it's running version 3. And then we can see different identifying pieces of information as well. So they are using the default community string. So we can connect, and it tells us things like, oh yeah, it really is Cisco. We can see the uptime for that device is 62 days. Right? We can see things like, oh, there's the MAC address. So if we did the reverse lookup on that first half of the MAC address, it would tell us, yeah, this is Cisco gear. And then here, if we were to connect on port 2002 and 6002, right? So these are probably, I suspect, Telnet, maybe SSH ports. But you can actually see, oh yeah, this is where we see Starbucks. So the ISP thought they were doing the right thing and that they labeled it with their customer name and data. They said, oh, okay, this belongs to this one customer. In this case, it's Starbucks. So this is probably some Starbucks coffee shop, or maybe it's a corporate location or a factory, but it's a Starbucks location, right? That was exposed because the ISP opened up that information to the internet, and it was found by Shodan. So it starts to give you an idea of some of the things that we can find in Shodan, even though we're going to talk a lot more about using Shodan itself. So remember, once we find IP addresses, that we want to find those open ports, and Shodan helps us with that. Now, a lot of times, especially when we talk about IT or IT pen testing, we talk about doing scanning, active scanning, right, with tools like Nmap. Right? Nmap is the default go-to tool for scanning IP addresses for open ports and trying to determine what service or application is running on those ports, and potentially if there's vulnerabilities, even though Nmap always stresses, right, it's not a vulnerability scanner per se. But in the OT world, right, we typically tend to veer away from active scanning. Remember, where we're using tools to create network packets and put them on the network and send them towards hosts that we don't even necessarily know what they are by default, because there are still some hosts in OT environments that they get those packets, they don't understand what the packet is trying to communicate, and it causes the host to hang or to reset, right? Or to crash, or to even crash to the point where you physically have to replace it. That still happens in 2025, 2026. I was just at DEF CON 2 months ago, And I heard from two different people working in two different power plants about how they both had blackouts because the power plant went down because somebody was doing scans with Nessus on the OT network looking for vulnerabilities. I think that was an outside consultant. And then another one had basically a PLC tech that had learned about Nmap and they were using it to scan the network and it caused outages. So you can have active tools that either cause outages with the different assets like PLCs and HMIs, or what I've also seen, especially in some larger environments where they have very poor networking. So a lot of times we should have managed switches that are configured so the switching architecture, right, is solid and you're not going to have any network communication issues. If you're using unmanaged switches though and you're just connecting a bunch of switches together, if you use a tool like Nmap, it's very easy to see that it quickly can overwhelm the network, which to the point where essentially you take up all the bandwidth and cause the network to crash. Your network crashes in an OT environment, your plant comes down, right? It just comes grinding to the halt. Just like if you crashed a PLC using a tool like Nmap or Nessus, think that PLC is monitoring and controlling equipment in the real world. Right? It's monitoring and controlling that process. If that PLC all of a sudden stops working, right? What happens to that equipment and what happens to the process? And are there safety or availability issues? Or almost always going to be at least availability issues, if not some safety issues as well. So we can find ports like with Shodan and Census is very similar to Shodan. There's others that we talk about, like Zoomeye is another one. Zoomeye is the Chinese version of Shodan, and we'll take a look at that as well before we wrap up. Now, the cool thing about Census is that they actually test for all 65,535 TCP ports, which is very cool. And then limited number of UDP ports. Again, it's hard to test a large amount of UDP ports just on the nature of how UDP works, where there's no three-way handshake like we have in TCP to determine whether very easily whether there's a port that's open or not. But we can use tools like Shodan and Census and Zoomeye to. I personally still say should they be scanning the entire internet for open ports? I mean, technically, if you're scanning my network and I don't give you permission, I say you're breaking the law. But at this point, and Shodan's been around, I think, for 20 years at this point, actually, maybe even a little longer. And it's where they do the scanning and we're just using the data that they make available. Right. And that's really the true nature of OSINT. And that we can look to see, hey, are there any open ports on different IP addresses? Like this is an example very similar to the router that we were looking at earlier. So we can see, port 22 for SSH, port 123, that's UDP for network time protocol, or SNMP for simple network monitor protocol. And then those 2002, 6002 ports that we could either telnet or SSH into, probably SSH. Now you see the other SSH port, and then get that banner to say, oh yeah, hey, this is a Starbucks, ISP router. Again, that's how we can understand, hey, what is actually there at that IP address. And so we can start, understanding, well, what about the PLCs and the HMIs that are exposed to the internet? Or what about once we're inside the OT network? How do we actually go through finding the different hosts and determining what they are? That's when we talk about the discovery and collection process. And that's the next part in the course. But we can use tools like Shodan and Census and Zoomeye. Just give it an IP address and it can say, hey, we scanned for all these ports and this is the information that we found associated with this port. So it gives us an idea of what type of host it is. And potentially, again, are there any vulnerabilities or ways that I can exploit the host to gain access to the network? So we want to find those ports because we do associate them with different services and applications. And so if we see something like TCP port 80, well, normally we say, oh, yeah, it's a website. Because 99.9999% of the time, it's used for HTTP, for hosting websites. One thing, though, just to keep in mind, when a tool says, hey, you have this open port, even Nmap will say, oh, I see port 80 open. That's normally associated with HTTP. You can put any service or application on any port. So just because you see port 80 is running or is open, it doesn't necessarily mean it's for HTTP. Probably is, but you want to do additional checks, like using the service and the script scans in a tool like Nmap to get more information. That's like what Shodan does. Or when we're going through kind of that idea of banner grabbing, even though some services don't necessarily have a banner per se, but we're going through that process of sending additional requests essentially for data. And they're crafted in specific ways to try to elicit different responses. And we can use those different responses to try to figure out, what's actually sitting on that port, on that IP address. And so here's that example that we were looking at, right, where we found that ISP router by looking up Starbucks. That's really easy to find. Or we'll see again some examples soon about how to find PLCs and HMIs that are exposed to the internet. Here's an example where, and this is, I love Siemens, right? Incredible company. They take security for their equipment very seriously, right? So I really admire them for all the work they do. But my one biggest pet peeve with them is that their equipment, like their PLCs, come with SNMP installed and running the default configuration, including the default community string, which, if you're not familiar, is basically a password that allows you to connect to the device and read its database with all the information about the device itself. So in this case, you can see we found one of the smaller Siemens PLCs that's exposed to the internet. It's the S7-300. So 300 is like the smaller the low end PLC. They actually just retired these. But we can find that information, right? We use that to find PLCs that are exposed to the internet. Now we know, hopefully by now, we shouldn't see any OT assets like PLCs or HMIs exposed to the internet. That's why we as pen testers or we as defenders want to do these searches ourselves to find, hey, do we or do our clients have any assets exposed to the internet that shouldn't be? Because most of the time these assets get exposed to the internet either because they don't realize they're exposed or they expose them to the internet thinking, oh, it's okay. Like in this case, it might be just a lack of awareness or education because you can actually see right here the contact is corporate IT, even though this is obviously an OT device. So it was probably somebody in corporate IT not realizing the dangers, not realizing the risk because of a lack of awareness and education. Here's another example of another piece of Siemens equipment, right? That's connected and exposed to the internet. And that we can actually see things like, the firmware version. And we can look that up to see, are there any known vulnerabilities associated with this firmware version with this piece of equipment? And then potentially those vulnerabilities, right, we can use to gain access. Because really, ultimately, right, we're going through this entire exercise to find not only these hosts, but ultimately, again, it's about finding those vulnerabilities, finding the cracks that we can slip through. Of course, we're doing this as pen testers to find those issues, to help our clients, or maybe we're doing this for our own company, right, to help them understand where the vulnerabilities are so we can get those resolved before an attacker or an auditor, I always joke, right, finds those issues and uses them against us. Now we can have false positives, and false positives, right, can always throw people off at times. So a false positive means you get a report saying you have a vulnerability, you have an issue. But then when you actually do the additional investigation, there actually is no vulnerability. It's like taking a pregnancy test and saying, "Oh, you're pregnant," when it's, like maybe I was the one taking the test, right? There's no way I'm pregnant, all right? I'm a guy. That would be considered a false positive. So sometimes you can have false positives if you're using different tools to find vulnerabilities. And that can be common in the OT or ICS world when we're using different network security monitoring tools to do things like build asset registers and find vulnerabilities. Because a lot of times, right, we're not doing things like active scanning. We're building that information off of passive monitoring of the network. But passive monitoring can only do so much. And so a lot of times, you can see false positives and you have to sort through those. So sometimes that can be frustrating, and it's frustrating to different folks in OT and IT, right? And when they're trying to work together, and right, we have to understand though, these tools do have false positives that we need to work through. But we need to work through them together. So that way, when we build out and then we find, well, the true positives, what are the real issues? Those are the things that we need to get fixed. Now, Shodan and other tools, right? Once they find those hosts and they gather that information, like in this case, remember, they gathered the firmware version. That then they're actually also trying to guess, well, are there any vulnerabilities associated with this service or this application? Yeah, you can see in this case, they're saying, oh, there's 21 high risk vulnerabilities and 782 medium risk and 194 low risk. More than likely, there are not that many vulnerabilities. So Shodan can be very prone, I think, to false positives because it throws I think it just sees SNMP and says, hey, there's all these issues. And maybe there's some Siemens vulnerabilities in there as well. So you do need to go through the list. That's a really long list. But if you're doing due diligence, go through the list. But I've never had like a lot of luck with using Shodan for finding vulnerabilities because it's very much like this. It just shows you way too many vulnerabilities that could be possible. It's not doing the checks necessary like a tool like Nessus would in the IT world, right, to determine do these vulnerabilities really exist or not. So that's challenge. I appreciate that they're trying to show you the vulnerabilities like we see here, but at the end of the day, I don't want to say it's worthless, but it's very challenging. How about to find that whether you would use that on a regular basis. Here's what it looks like, if you were to dig in, and then really for most of these, you're having to look up each of those CVE, or if you're not familiar, that's a vulnerability entry in a database of known vulnerabilities maintained by the United States government. So now, if I do have, right, and understand a type of asset or a piece of software or firmware that's running, and I have the version information, that's where we can use tools like Google, or you talk about the ICS advisory project that Dan Ritchie runs to actually do a lookup to see, hey, are there any known vulnerabilities associated with this system? So in this case, you can see, oh, for a compact logic, maybe, can we find a vulnerability and say, oh, yes, there's this vulnerability from 2017 because we see CVE 2017-9312. So that was the 9,312th vulnerability reported that year out of all vulnerabilities. So that's all vendors and all manufacturers and all types of software and equipment. And you see, oh, it's a denial of service attack. So somebody might be able to crash that piece of equipment or force it to restart. And then we can get additional information. In the IT world, I don't really worry about denial of service issues. They kind of work themselves out if people or attackers are going to use them in the first place, which they typically don't. Right? They don't want to bring your systems down that way. They want to keep them up and running with a ransomware node on them. But you can get all the details, and you can find, oh, if it's this type of controller, right, on this firmware version, yes, it's vulnerable. So then once you find the vulnerability, remember, in the OT world, we work with the engineers and the operators of the plant to understand, hey, is this a vulnerability that impacts safety or the operations of the plant itself? So we can use that to determine, hey, do we need to fix this or not? Or if we need to fix it, how soon do we need to fix it? Because it's not going to impact safety. We might wait till the next maintenance window to actually patch it. And here's an example of going back to the very beginning of the section where there's an example of that PLC that was exposed to the internet. It actually showed us, here's the type of equipment, and here is the firmware version, 30.011. So if we were lining that up, just say, play pretend with this one vulnerability announcement, right? We can actually see that, oh yeah, this PLC would be vulnerable to this denial of service attack because the PLC is running 30.011 where controllers earlier than 30.014 are vulnerable. So that's why finding the firmware version is one of those important pieces of information in the OT world. So Lab 5.2 is going to walk through not only Shodan and finding some assets on the internet, what's exposed, looking at are there any vulnerabilities. Again, you can see where the challenge is, where Shodan is just telling you like there's all of these vulnerabilities. There's a lot of false positives. And there's also a command line tool that somebody had created called SMAP. And so what SMAP does is uses nmap command syntax to do lookups in Shodan using the Shodan API. Now, the original tool that the gentleman wrote, and I forget his name, and I feel bad. I should put it in here. But the original tool just uses the free API, which is great, but it's very limited, right? You can only run a few searches through Shodan before it times out. So I recreated the functionality using ChatGPT. And so you can actually put an API key, even just the API key you get with the free account, it will actually allow you to do more searches, believe it or not. Yeah, it's better than not having an API key at all. And so you can run more searches. I think it runs a little bit more smoother. Not that there's anything wrong with the original version, but the newer version I did with ChatGPT just seems to work a little smoother for some reason. So that's Lab 5.2. So in the next part of this section, we're going to talk about how we can find control systems using general or generic or normal search engines like just Google. So this goes back, it's about 2 years now, where I remember when the NSA released the EliteWolf project. I was really excited because I remember when the NSA had released their tool called Ghidra. This was at DEF CON, probably 7, 8, maybe 9, 10 years ago. It kind of all runs together at this point. But they released Ghidra, which was their tool that they would use to reverse engineers and write things like buffer overflow exploits. And it was really exciting for folks. And so while that was very cool, so when they came out with the EliteWolf project and they said, right, it's OT focused, and I was like, oh, this is so exciting. And then when you would log in, or you would go to their GitHub repository, you would actually see really just three main text files. And what they were, I opened it up, I didn't even, because I just saw Allen Bradley, Siemens, Schweitzer. I think they've renamed them since, because now they actually say Snort. Because if you open these up, what they are, and I would say is what all they are is they're snort signatures. And if you're not familiar with Snort's the most popular open source intrusion detection platform there is. Cisco actually bought them and integrated it into their platform. It became their intrusion detection system, but they're still an open source version. And so I was looking at these and I was like, well, these are just snort signatures. And if you look at them, we read them left to right. Now, on the right-hand side, right, you can actually have the string of data, right, that you're looking for, that you're searching as your packets go over the wire. So in this case, if you ever see /rockform/ advanced diags !, blah, 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 it would trigger this alert on the console, and it would say EliteWolf, Allen Bradley, Rockwell Automation, URL path activity. What this actually tracked to is if somebody connected to a web page on your Rockwell PLC, on your Allen Bradley / Rockwell PLC, it would set up this alert. Now, a lot of environments, you might actually have somebody just connect to a PLC web page. So this isn't going to be helpful in all environments. In some environments, yeah, if you're a very strict environment and you tell everybody don't connect to a web page on the PLC, you might not even have a web page, right, connected to a PLC. But if somebody tries to connect, that would set off an alert. So I kind of was like, I get it, but how helpful is this? I don't see it as super, super helpful. And it was just kind of really a big letdown with compared to I was expecting something like Ghidra for OT. And it's just like 3 files of snort signatures. So actually I really actually remember being pretty kind of, like I said, almost, pretty upset. Not that I had a reason to be, but it's just really disappointing. So I remember closing the browser, getting up, I went and started to make lunch. And then I realized, I was like, wait a minute. It's like, that's a URL. I'm like, well, we can put URLs in search engines like Google. So it's like, okay, let's take that, run a search, and then, we can actually find PLCs that are connected to the internet by running Google searches. The interesting thing about this, because now that I've been running these searches for about 2 years, is that the number of PLCs that are exposed to internet, and there's about 50 of them ish. It's actually, the number of them is actually slowly increasing. I mean, we're not talking about big numbers, but we would expect and we would want to see the number decreasing over time, right? As people realize, we shouldn't expose our OT assets like PLCs to the internet. But we do see them increase over time, which is, again, not what we want to see. So we still have a lot of work to do on the awareness and education front. But here's, for that page, if you hit a PLC, this is what it looks like, right? It's the TCP statistics for that PLC. Again, it shouldn't be exposed to the internet. Attacker's not going to use this to take control over the asset. But what else is exposed on the PLC? My favorite, and here's the our ARP tables, right? So we can see, which I find fascinating, right? Because we can see all the internal assets that are on that local network that the PLC can see communication to and from, which would include broadcast traffic. So we can see that internal network is 182.168.3, and we can see all these hosts, .2, .5, .6, and you have the MAC addresses. So remember, we can take those MAC addresses, do a reverse lookup to see, well, what's the vendor of each of these hosts? We shouldn't be able to see this information. Now, it's one of those where if you can see things like MAC addresses and internal IP addresses, right? Is it something an attacker is going to use to take full control over your network in the blink of an eye? No, of course not. So when I see, private IP addresses on the internet, is it the end of the world? No, but it does speak to the fact that you do have a crack in your security program that you need to fix, right? We just shouldn't see internal IP addresses and MAC addresses exposed to the internet. So it's just saying you have an issue you need to fix. It's not critical, it's not high risk, but there's an issue that you need to address. It's just some basic fundamentals. Now, this is the page that I really like and I find fascinating because this is the TCP connection table, or this is like if you run netstat on Windows or Linux, right? It shows you all the active connections with the system. So you can see, sure, the internal IP address of the PLC is 192.168.3.130. But then you can also see, people connecting to it over port 80. If I remember when I was looking at this one example, and you'll walk through this in the lab, but that remote address, the 71.85.4.152, yeah, that's me. But then if you also look at the local port, so 44818, and you can see it under the local port and remote port, that's for SIP or over Ethernet IP. That's the main protocol that Rockwell PLCs talk, which is the type of PLC that we're looking at. And so you think, I'm like, I can understand if an asset is exposed to the internet and people are hitting port 80, right? Because even Google will hit port 80 looking for websites to index. But why would somebody be connected to an OT protocol port? And so I can understand, you can see those internal IP addresses, those 192.168.3 hosts that are actually connecting and talking with the PLC. And those are probably, that's probably legit operations. Probably. But what about this 166.246.162.20? Is that an attacker, or is that maybe legitimate, for this company where they're communicating, over the internet? It shouldn't be, but they could. I've seen it more than a few times. But so EliteWolf initially I thought was a real bust, and I think from an intrusion detection, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it was, like I said, it was a letdown. I should say it's not. I shouldn't say it's worthless. It's not worthless. It just wasn't what I was expecting. But I've had a lot of interesting fun, right, running Google searches to find PLCs that are exposed to the internet using those signatures. So in a way, I think they were helping, but I think by as much as I talk about this, I don't know if it's helping or not. But ultimately, right, this is where we can run those Google searches, and we have the public IP address. So we can just visit the main public IP address and get the main website for the PLC, and it even tells us, hey, you can see the vendor make and model right on that first page. And again, remember also that firmware version. So we can use that to look up to see, are there any vulnerabilities associated with this device? And right, there's our little device. There's our little buddy. So, and these are the ones actually, which is funny because SANS uses these in their advanced defense course for ICS. So, but that's how we can use just generic search engines like Google to find these assets. Now, if you try Bing will only show you results for the EliteWolf GitHub page. They don't actually show you any of the PLCs. It's like they realize what you're trying to do and they shut you down. If you try DuckDuckGo, it doesn't show you anything. So it just says, we're not going to show you anything related to it. Google used to be really good at not, filtering results when they think you're up to no good, which of course, I wouldn't say we're not up to no good, but think of how this can be used by attackers, not just pen testers, or I would describe myself as a security researcher at this point. So again, it's interesting because again, it's not just about Shodan or Census or Zoomi. We can find these assets with just a normal search engine like Google. So Lab 5.3 is going to walk you through that process. You're going through the EliteWolf GitHub page, going through the text file of snort signatures, and then using those URLs as search strings or Google dorks, right? These pre-canned Google searches that we can do lookups for and find exposed assets on the internet, right? So I have a lot of fun with this. So hopefully you will too. If you want to really dig deeper into OSINT for OT and ICS, I have an entire, this is like a 10, almost 11 hour course. I think it's actually 12 hours by the time you do the review questions and stuff, which is the last part. So yeah, if you want to get even more into OSINT, right, for targeting environments, the first half is more the IT related OSINT. So finding things like email addresses so you can send phishing emails and phone numbers so you can call up employees on the phone and just ask them questions like what's your username and password, and sometimes they give you that information. Or there's a lot of sections in there about how, looking at social media and things that people post on LinkedIn and YouTube and other social media platforms that they shouldn't. So again, if you want to dig more into it, definitely check out the course on the YouTube channel, which of course you're already there because you're watching this. And I will add, there's other courses. And there we also spend the time going through Shodan and instances. ZoomEye is not in that version, but it's coming in a new version. And there's actually dedicated videos just for Shodan, just for Nmap. Also, I know we talked a little bit about it in this section. So you can find lots more videos, and then want to kind of reduplicate the information for this part of the course. But again, there's plenty more to watch. And again, if you have any questions, drop them in the comment section, or you can always reach out to me directly. So I appreciate you watching this part of the course. And if you haven't already, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. But again, thanks again, and I'll see you in the next part.